Hey everybody, Kevin Frisch here with the Frisch Marionette Company out of Cincinnati, Ohio, and I am going to make a puppet head using MendALL's wood filler. Now, MendALL works the same way that plastic wood did up until about the mid-1980s, when plastic wood changed their formula, making it virtually impossible to use in this casting method. It was at about that same time that I'd moved to New York and started working for the Puppet Works in Brooklyn under the direction of Nick Coppola. And he had already gotten rid of plastic wood and was using MendALL. And that's where I'd first heard about it, and I just assumed that everybody in the business had made the switch. What I've discovered is that very few people even know about the product. So I want to make this video to demonstrate how great this product is and to show how I use it to make the wood filler puppet heads. We're going to start off with a clay model made out of plasticine, which is an oil-based clay. And here you can see I've made a three-part plaster mold using the shim method. Basically, you divide the model into three sections using brass shims and pour the plaster mold in three separate sessions. Once the plaster is completely cured and hardened, let it dry a little bit. Usually wait a day or so after making the plaster mold. Then we're ready for step one. Step one is to submerge the plaster mold in water. Water is going to be our mold release in this process. So we're going to let that sit in the water for a few hours to make sure that all the air bubbles have escaped the plaster and are replaced by water. It's a very, very important step. Wood filler is essentially wood dust or wood flour combined with a binding agent or some sort of binder or glue and some sort of solvent. MendALL uses acetone. And the trick with wood filler is it will stick to anything and everything except for water, which is why you must make sure that the plaster mold is completely saturated with water and that your hands are wet when you're working with the wood filler. Next, step two, we're going to press the wood filler into the mold. So you pat out a pancake of the wood filler and tamp it or press it into the wet mold. And because this will be submerged in water, we don't want that wood filler separating from the plaster mold. So once we have it in there, we're pretty confident we pressed it tightly against the plaster mold and got rid of as many air bubbles as possible. Then we're going to fill the cavity with marbles. The marbles will weigh the wood filler down in the water. Okay, we're going to start with larger marbles too. Because we don't want the small marbles to press down into that wood dough and either get trapped or press down too far and make a hole in the wood dough. So I start with a couple of bigger marbles for the bottom, and then we fill in with the smaller marbles up on top. And we do that with both halves. But the front half, of course, is made in two sections, so we're going to rubber band that together. And again, we are going to keep our hands wet and the mold wet so that the wood filler doesn't stick to us. And again, starting with the larger marbles so that they don't sink so deeply into the filler, followed by the smaller marbles. And now we'll let these sit in the water overnight. Okay, these have been sitting in the water for about 8 hours, and now it's time to remove the pressings from the mold. If you've ever worked with acetone before, you know that it evaporates very quickly, and it will evaporate in the air as well as in water. The wood filler actually hardens while it's submerged in the water, and water will replace the solvent. So when I remove the head from the mold, you're going to see that the wood dough now looks a little cakey and spongy, and I'll even press on it so you can see that it's a little mushy. That's because the water's still in there, but the wood filler has hardened. The next step is to take this out and let it air dry, and if you're in an area of the country where you can put it out in the sun, I think that's the best. Get the airflow and the sun working on it. If you just have to air dry it in the house, you can put a fan on it to help speed it up and to dry it out. And then once it's dried out, we're going to be ready to put the halves together. And this is where I will use a knife and maybe some files to trim up the flashing and some of the edges. On the two halves, I want to get rid of all that junk and bring it back to the shim line so that the two halves will marry together properly. As far as the surface, as you're looking at that, it looks just horrible, but it's not a problem because the way I'm going to finish this up, believe it or not, that face is going to be smooth and I won't even need to use sandpaper. That's why I love this method. Okay, so now it's a process of filing down and just sort of like trimming the edges, going back and forth between the files and the knife. Now at this point, I really am not worried about patching any of the air pockets and cracks that you're seeing there on the face. We're going to do that in a second with the little mixture. This particular process of making a wood filler head is nothing new. It has been documented in a couple of books. One of the books is Puppets, Methods, and Materials by Alan Fortney and Cedric Flower. You also find the process documented in what is known in the industry as the Beaten Bible, which was a book written by Mabel and Les Beaton called Marionettes, A Hobby for Everyone. The Beaton book was probably one of the most influential puppetry books written. It has been republished through Dover Publications. It's now called The Complete Book of Marionettes, and it's worth having. Okay, next step is to put the halves together. I've got them lined up pretty well now. And the way I used to do it was to put a bead of glue, like Duco cement, along the rim there, and then rubber band the two halves together to glue them together. I don't do that anymore. Now I just use the solution that we're going to finish the head with to actually marry the two halves together. I'll show you how to make that right now. First, you're going to need MendALL's Wood Plastic Solvent. And this really is the key to my process. You're going to mix a little bit of the solvent with a little bit of wood filler and a little bit of cornstarch, because I really believe the cornstarch helps to make the mixture smoother. You're going to need a little glass container or a metal container to mix this in. This is the metal container that I use to make the mixture, and you can see I've used it many times. And it looks like garbage, but the fact is I can add a little bit of the MendALL solvent to it and a little bit of acetone, and within a few minutes the mixture that's already dried up in there will come back to life and the brush will be back to life as well. Another aspect of this product is that the solvent rises to the top, which is why it's shipped upside down. And you want to keep that upside down until you're ready to use it to press the molds. But once you have the open side up, leave it that way because the solvent will rise to the top and you can use that for the finishing as well. What I'm going to show you here is I just take that mixture of solvent and wood dough, and there you see my brush is totally, just by putting acetone in that bucket after about maybe in 45 minutes or so, the brush wakes up completely. So here's the syrup, what the syrup looks like, the solvent. The most important part of this process is that solvent. And you're going to mix up different consistencies through this process. For the gluing the seam together, I want a little bit of a thicker mixture. So you take the two halves, you're going to paint each edge up, and what that will start doing is actually softening that edge. Not a lot, but just a little bit. It will soften up the wood that's already hardened. And it's soaking into all those pores. You saw how porous that wood filler is. And what the solvent will do is it's going to go, with a little bit of the wood filler blended into it, it's going to fill up all of those cavities and the nooks and crannies of the dried out wood filler. But anyway, I've glued both seams, and now I'm putting the two halves together, and I want to make sure they line up just by touch using my finger. Make sure those seams are even. Don't even need to worry about those drips at this point. And once I feel that that's in the right spot, then I'm going to brush more of this mixture into that seam. And this stuff will start setting up immediately. That's why I don't bother with the glue and the rubber band anymore. Again, I'm not really concerned about the big air pockets and the big blemishes on them yet. Just want to get the head together. Now, while that's setting up, I'm going to start working on the blemishes. And I just take a little bit of wood dough, whatever you think the right consistency is. And the way I work it, it doesn't even matter that it's lumpy there because I'm going to brush on that solvent and it's going to smooth it all down. That seam will be reinforced at some point. If I were doing animations on the puppet, I would cut the back of the head off and then I'd have access into the head and take some wood dough and reinforce that seam with the wood putty, the wood dough. I'm going to just spend a little time working at the blemishes. I cannot stand sanding, so I've come up with this method, much more enjoyable. The other beautiful thing about MendALL is that you can take a head like this and change its character by adding material onto the nose. You can turn it into another character, turn this little guy into an elf by adding pointy ears, and there you see already a difference. Again, no sandpaper used on this. It was all patching the bigger air pockets with the wood dough and then just smoothing out with that concoction, which is essentially varying amounts of solvent, wood filler, acetone, and a little bit of cornstarch. The cornstarch, I believe, just helps to smooth it a little bit. And that's how you do it.